This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Freest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Creating Your Encore Life so that you can do the work you love when you want and where you want. Thanks for listening. With an Encore Life, you can be creating value in the world beyond just winning that next pickleball game. So if you're ready to get started today, please contact me at lynn@lynnfreest.com. Again, thanks for listening. This is episode 203, and the title is Making Transitions at Any Age. And while I've talked a lot in the past about creating an encore career or creating an encore life, I've been thinking more recently about just this whole concept of transitions. And transitions, quite frankly, happen to us at any age. And so it's one of those things where just the whole idea of it's not just those who are leaving a corporate life, but even within life, you're going to have transitions. So I'm going to do a quick overview. A couple of books have really informed my thinking on this. And the first one is Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age by Bruce Feiler. And the second one is also his. It's The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. So we won't try to go through the whole book today, but I just want to share some highlights with you. And why is this important? The world's changing faster and more disruptively. And interesting, from my perspective, at my age, we've been saying that forever, but it is true. You just think of, for example, how AI went from something people heard about to something that's on the tip of everybody's tongue now. And will it create Armageddon? We've had those moments before in life, but it is true. The world is changing, and so our need to go through transitions and adapt is more important than ever. And I think another thing, again, with my interest in the second half of life, is in the past, the adult life may have comprised 4 or 5 decades. So you had a certain period of time that you worked, and maybe there was a shorter period of time where you were, quote, retired or not working. But now you may be faced with your adult life being 7 or 8 decades. Not quite twice as long, but, significantly more time than we ever had before. So again, inevitably, we're going to have more transitions in life than we had in the past. Also, and this gets into what Bruce Feiler is talking about, is life is often nonlinear. Now, I think as we'll talk about with his study, maybe it was always nonlinear for many people. But in the past, if we went to school, then we went to work for a company, and then we retired, it all fell in line. And people worked for the same place for 20 or, like me, 40 years. That's pretty much not how things are working anymore. And life is going to be different. And in his proposal, we could call it nonlinear. Now, in his book, he's really doing, I'll say, a human investigation into the ways that how our narratives change and how we as individuals can reclaim some agency in this change. Often we think we're just subject to change, but there's also the possibility that we can have an influence in that. So in his story project, and that sort of informs almost both of his books, he went through and interviewed a huge number, hundreds of people. And then on top of that, with some new techniques, he analyzed the stories that he heard to find data or themes or key takeaways that informed what he had to say in the book. So in the first book, the first thing he kind of defines is what he calls life quakes. And this is beyond the disruptions that we face in just our everyday life. These are the things that are really, they're significant for us. Now, it could be individually like a divorce. It could be like losing a spouse or child, but also it could be collective. So obviously, we just went through a pandemic. People start thinking back. We had the Great Recession. And then there's my mother, who's almost 97, and she went through the Great Depression. So there are often things that are Sometimes we get to choose them, and Bruce talks about this in his book, but often they're involuntary, where they just happen, and then we have to see what we can do to navigate through them. The other thing he says is these, what he calls life quakes. In his research, again, he was talking to people. You might get 3 to 5 of these in a lifetime, maybe more, especially if you have a longer life. But actually, they can last from 4 to 5 years, fully recovering from the pandemic. Here we are now this was recorded in 2023. We're actually a couple years away from the pandemic, but it still has an impact on our lives. Likewise, I'm sure in my mother's case, the recession, which went on for a long time by itself, but then the recovery from that, it took time for people. And I think sometimes some of the mindsets and things that affected my mother then, they are still in how she thinks about the world today. So again, these life quakes, and it could be like losing a job. And maybe you have to struggle for a while to quite find that new job that is really what you're looking for. So again, we have to have patience as we go through some of these things. And so then in his book, he talks about 3 stages of the transition. And this, I believe, really builds on the work of William Bridges, who 30 years ago talked about it. But he says there's the leaving, the long goodbye, as Bruce talks about it, the messy middle, and then the new beginning. And again, different authors have used different words to describe these things, but that whole idea of maybe the long goodbye is a period of grieving. The job you lost, the spouse you lost, whatever it may be, or the year you lost during COVID. But each of us has a transition to make. And some of us are better at different parts of it. In other words, it's easier for us to say goodbye to the old world and move ahead. Some of us, the messy middle. Some people find that exciting, a period of learning, reinvention. Some people find it very daunting. It's a period of being lost or uncertain of what's going to happen next. And then there's the new beginning. What comes next? And I think often we explore things and we try things and they don't work. And in the case of finding a new or an interesting job. So we have to do some things in that whole period. Now, in Bruce's research, what he found is some of us are better at different phases of this. Some of us really don't handle the messy middle well. Some of us find it hard to really start something new and get into it. I've been thinking about some of these things and how would I describe the transition process? And it might be, again, can we let go of what was before? Obviously, that was our comfort zone. That was maybe where we enjoyed being. Who knows? But can we let go of that? And then there's a period of, you could call it learning. Some people call it a struggle. Some people call it exploring. But there's some period in there where you have to find out kind of where's your attention going to go to next. But then I'll say there's also a period of practice, okay? You've decided on a new direction. You've decided on new activities. So you actually have to practice some of these new things that you're going to be trying to do. And then finally, we get to the spot where it's performance. You've started the new career, the new life, the moving on, whatever it may be, but you're actually into the new thing. And now that's not the end point because, as he says, with life quakes and different things, this is all a cycle. So you can expect, again, if you've got that 7 or 8 decades of adult life, you can expect to go through these cycles in each of those decades, possibly. So it's one of those things where it's always a cycle, and you have to be conscious of how do I let go of what happened before? How do I find what could be next? How do I actually practice to become skillful in what I'm going to do next? And then how do I actually embrace and perform in that new arena? Another thing that comes up is Bruce Feiler talks about 7 tools for navigating these transitions. So he has a little more detail than what I've just talked about. He says, accept it. In other words, it has happened. We sometimes deny it, mark it. And sometimes he says you need to really sit down and reflect on it, take some time. Yep, and it's often part of a grieving process. Then shed it. In other words, be able to step away from it. Again, if this has been part of your life, the way literally the habits that you did through life, is actually hard to let go of those habits because they're ingrained in you. Then he talks about create it. So that's where I was talking about learning and practicing. And then another interesting piece he talks about, this isn't a solo thing. He says share it is what he talks about. But this whole idea that probably the best transitions happen in some community. So I think I've talked about this in the past, that if you wanted an encore career, you need to find a set of new friends. So somehow in this thing, and it can be with your family, friends that you have, but the idea is you are in this, in some sense, collectively, even though you feel that you're in it by yourself. Then his second to last step is launch it. And that's where I would say the practice or the performance. And his final step is tell it. So it's acknowledge that this is who I am now, and let people know maybe I was something else before in terms of my career, but this is what I am now. Before I was an engineer, now I'm an entrepreneur helping people make transitions. So it's let people know, because often people just remember what you were. They don't always understand what you are today. Then in other words, Bruce Feiler's things, there's the top 3 emotions people struggle with. And I think this is an important part of any of these transitions, is acknowledging that emotions are part of it, and that they can either have us stuck, they can help us grow, but your emotions are always part of this. And he says the 3 emotions that most people struggled with were fear, sadness, and shame. And then the next ones were guilt and anger and loneliness. So you think about those in any transitions you've made. Fear, sadness, and shame, they can all be part of that, as well as guilt, anger, and loneliness. All of that can happen. Again, I think it's useful to consider those things as you consider your transitions. And quite frankly, the other piece is you have to develop some new habits, I think, as part of that learning or practice, as I described it. So what are the things you need to do to learn differently? Because you're going to create a new life which has a new set of habits from what you did before. Another thing, then the other book that I'm reading currently and finding very interesting, he calls it The Search, Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. And again, he's building on his work all these interviews he did and the data he got from them. But he really talks about the American dream and how we need to reimagine the American dream. He says most of the historical descriptions of the American dream came from people who were successful, had a lot of advantages in life, at least in some cases. And so when he did all these interviews, he was very intentional about getting a wide diversity of life stories from people who had resources, advantages, people who had none, people who went through long periods of times where life was a struggle for them. So that he said, that gave me a better feel for what he talked about now in this second book as to what do you do and how do you create a career when in a nonlinear world where, as we said earlier, you'll probably have to reinvent your career multiple times. So he talked a little bit about all the different people. And I think that's one of the interesting pieces in this kind of a book, or these 2 books, is it's really about the stories that people had and the things they experienced, the fact that it wasn't all unicorns and rainbows as they found their new beginning. Instead, it was often repeated struggles. So I think it's probably is a more accurate way to describe how we might do things. The fact that we fall into bad habits or old habits or circle back to things that we know didn't work before. I think this is an important part of his book that he says, yeah, this is part of human life. And while we have the Horatio Alger stories of from rags to riches, and it all seems to be very linear and very enthusiastic, it isn't always that way. I think this whole idea, though, of reimagining the American dream is and the fact that it's a cyclical thing, that we're going to reimagine and reinvent ourselves multiple times in life, is an important concept. In the end here, I do encourage you to check out these books. I think they're very useful. I will continue. There are authors that I've found very compelling on the idea of transitions in life, and I'll be sharing information about those in the future. So to get started on your next journey of transitions, your second half of life, or reinventing your current life, please contact me at lynn@lynnfrias.com. I also have some resources listed in the show notes, and you can look at those. So With that, look forward to talking with you again.